There's a trail in western Germany that hikers walk on weekends. It is narrow. The trees are tall and close together. In autumn, when the leaves fall and the undergrowth dies back, you can see shapes in the ground on either side of the path. Long, shallow depressions, perfectly rectangular, running in lines through the forest floor. They are foxholes, thousands of them. Nobody put a sign up. Nobody marked them. The forest just grew back over them and kept them, the way forests keep everything they are given. In the autumn of 1944, the United States Army sent division after division into these trees. The mud was black, not brown black. The kind that pulls a boot off a man's foot and doesn't give it back. The trees didn't break when the shells hit. They exploded into splinters. 1,000-kilogram trunks, over a ton. Some more than 2,200 pounds, turned into shrapnel moving at bullet speed. Medics couldn't tell steel wounds from wood wounds. A lot of men bled out before anyone figured out which was which. The forest didn't even echo. Explosions just thudded, flat and dead, swallowed by the timber. You'd hear a burst hit the dirt, and the man next to you was already gone. 33,000 Americans went into the Hürtgen Forest. Most people have never heard of it. The men who survived it mostly never talked about it, because the Hürtgen didn't have a story that made sense. There was no moment you could point to and say, that is why it mattered. There was just the forest, and the foxholes it kept. Would you keep sending men into a forest, knowing the casualties, knowing the terrain, and knowing the plan wasn't working, because stopping meant admitting it never should have started? That question cost 33,000 men. And what happened here didn't just kill them. It helped make the Battle of the Bulge possible. Almost nobody connects those two things. By September 1944, American forces had broken out of Normandy, arrived at the German border, and stalled. Supply lines couldn't keep pace. Nobody had overwhelming strength anywhere. Sitting directly in front of First Army was the Hürtgen Forest, 140 square kilometers, roughly 54 square miles, of dense fir and pine, terrain that negated American advantages in air power, armor, and artillery entirely. The reasoning seemed sound. German observers in those trees had clear fields of fire over every supply road the advance depended on. The Roer River dams further east were another problem. German control meant they could flood the entire valley and trap any American force that had already crossed. The forest had to be cleared. Paper doesn't bleed. The 9th Infantry Division entered first, mid-September. 3 weeks, 3 kilometers gained, less than 2 miles. 4,500 casualties, including most of the experienced NCOs and junior officers who knew how to keep men alive in difficult terrain. The replacements who came in didn't have that knowledge. Neither did the next division. The after-action report went up the chain. It named every single thing that was about to kill the next division. The commanders read it. They sent the next division in anyway. Here's what you need to understand, because this changes everything. After the war, a General der Infantry Friedrich Köchling, commanding 81st Corps, was asked about the Hürtgen. His answer is in the interrogation transcripts, declassified in 1953. He said the Hürtgen Forest was the one place we hoped they would attack. Not expected. Hoped. The Germans had built the Hürtgen into a machine. Every trail pre-registered. Every bunker positioned for interlocking fire. Armor held on reverse slopes. The Americans hadn't walked into stubborn resistance. They had walked into something designed specifically to receive them. And they kept walking in. The 28th Infantry Division, the Keystone Division, Pennsylvania men, entered the Hürtgen in early November 1944. Veterans of Normandy and the liberation of Paris, not green troops. Experienced soldiers walking into something their experience hadn't prepared them for. As their objective was Schmidt, 5 kilometers inside the German line, about 3 miles in, overlooking the Roer dams. The only supply route was the Kall Trail, a narrow track that became impassable mud within hours. Engineers flagged it as inadequate. The attack proceeded because stopping meant losing momentum. That calculation would cost 6,000 men. On November 2nd, the 112th Infantry reached Schmidt. For 36 hours, it looked like it might work. Then, the Germans counterattacked. Panzer IV tanks came down from the ridge east of Schmidt. The anti-tank guns never arrived. The Kall Trail had collapsed under the weight of the advance. Trucks overturned. One Sherman blocked the route entirely. Supporting armor never arrived. Air support was grounded. The last transmission from Schmidt came at 0652 hours on November 4th. Baker 6, this is Dog 3 actual. We have enemy armor on the eastern approach, bearing 090 range approximately 400 meters, just under 440 yards. Anti-tank weapons, negative effect. Request immediate support. Over. There was nothing to send, and no way to send it. The withdrawal became something worse than a retreat. Men came back through the Kall Gorge in fragments, pairs, individuals, moving through forests they couldn't navigate in the dark, passing bodies they couldn't stop for, wounded they couldn't carry, making decisions they would carry for the rest of their lives. The 112th Infantry went in with 2,200 men. It came out with fewer than 300. I want you to sit with that, not as a statistic. The 28th Infantry Division lost 6,184 men in less than 3 weeks. It was one of the most experienced formations in First Army. Losing it, not in a breakthrough, not in a battle that changed the map, but in a forest that would be abandoned weeks later, meant that when the Germans came through the Ardennes in December, one of the units that should have slowed them down simply wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed, consumed by trees. The 4th Infantry Division came in to replace the 28th, then the 1st, then the 83rd. Division after division fed into the same ground. And here's the question you should be asking: why did nobody stop it? Because stopping meant admitting the initial decision was wrong. Because the longer you commit, the more men sent in, the more ground paid for in blood, the harder it becomes to walk away. You know what that is? Sunk cost. The more you invest, the harder it becomes to stop, even when stopping is the only rational choice left. The men in the forest paid the tuition for that lesson. By mid-November, platoons were led by privates because there were no sergeants left. Replacement soldiers arrived without knowing their units and died in a forest whose name they'd barely learned. Unit cohesion was gone. Officers led men whose names they didn't know into positions held by men who were already dead. Medics stopped marking aid stations with red crosses. The Germans had started targeting them. The 4th Division's war diary records 3 consecutive days of attacks, producing a combined gain of less than 500 meters, under 550 yards, at a cost of over 1,500 casualties. The entry for the 3rd day reads, in its entirety, objective not secured, heavy casualties, attack to resume at 0600 hours. Nobody came to stop it. Ernest Hemingway, embedded with the 22nd Infantry, called it Passchendaele with tree bursts. He didn't write much about it afterward. There are things that resist being turned into literature. In early December, the 2nd Ranger Battalion, veterans of Pointe du Hoc, went in to take Hill 400. A fortified ridge overlooking roads American forces needed to reach the Roer. Every other unit sent at it had been stopped. The Rangers went in because there was nothing else left to try. They took it at dawn, in a bayonet charge, because there was no other way. Then they held it. 48 hours, 5 counterattacks, no resupply, no reinforcements. When they were finally relieved, the battalion had taken 60% casualties. The roads below were still contested. The Roer was still beyond reach. Hill 400 didn't open anything. It just cost the Rangers a battalion, in a forest that didn't need to be taken at all. If you've seen our episode on Lanzerath Ridge, where 18 men held off an SS regiment for most of a December morning, here is what that episode couldn't fully explain. Why was that section of the Ardennes line so thin? The 28th Infantry Division, those Pennsylvania men ground up in Schmidt and the Kall Gorge, was sent to the Ardennes to rest. Still depleted, still under strength. The 110th Infantry was holding a 70-mile front, over 100 kilometers, with the strength of a single regiment, because that was all that remained. On December 16, 1944, the Germans launched the Ardennes offensive directly into that sector. Some of those men fought two of the worst battles of the entire war within 6 weeks of each other. Hürtgen to the Bulge, without rest, without replacements, without time to rebuild what the forest had taken. The Bulge nearly worked. It came closer to breaking the Allied line than almost anyone acknowledged at the time. And one of the reasons it came that close was standing in a forest 60 miles to the north. Nearly 100 kilometers away, 33,000 men who should have been rested and ready, but weren't. Most of these men never got a monument, no battlefield park, no national memorial. Just a few weathered plaques most tourists walk past without stopping. If this video is the closest thing to a marker some of them get, share it. And if you want to be here when we cover the next one, subscribe. Did the Hürtgen have to happen? When you actually examine it, the logic comes apart. The rower dams, the objective that made the campaign supposedly necessary, were sometimes not mentioned in operational orders at all. Men were dying for a goal the people sending them in hadn't clearly defined. And the forest could have been bypassed. Analysis available to First Army showed American forces could have swung north, left a containment force, and pushed toward the Rhine without entering those trees. The German divisions inside would have been irrelevant the moment the front moved east. But bypassing meant admitting that going in was a mistake. Koschling understood this. His hope that the Americans would attack wasn't optimism. It was a precise reading of how institutional momentum works. Once committed, the logic of commitment keeps you coming. He was right. Here's what the after-action reports don't tell you. American forces captured the Rower Dams in February 1945. They arrived to find the Germans had already sabotaged the discharge valves. Not blown the dams, that would have flooded German-held territory too. Instead, they opened the valves in a controlled way, slowly enough to protect their own lines, steadily enough to flood the Rower Valley for weeks. The dams were taken. The flooding happened anyway. Every man who bled in those trees had fought toward an objective rendered irrelevant by a set of sabotaged valves and a rising river. The flooding delayed the American crossing by 2 weeks. And 2 weeks in February 1945 probably didn't change the outcome of the war. But 33,000 men had died on the premise that it would. And in the end, the dams controlled themselves. The generals who ordered the attacks were never censured. Some were promoted. Courtney Hodges commanded First Army all the way to the Elbe. He died in 1966. He never publicly discussed the Hürtgen. No inquiry was ever opened. Admitting it was a strategic mistake would have required admitting that the men who ordered it were wrong. And institutions, like the commanders inside them, find that harder than almost anything else. The Army never officially called it a mistake. So officially, it wasn't one. 33,000 American casualties. German losses estimated between 28,000 and 50,000. As the forest absorbed both armies with equal indifference. Most survivors didn't talk about it. The Hürtgen had no clear narrative, no heroic defense, no dramatic breakthrough. Just weeks of cold and mud and dying in a forest. And then it was over, and the war moved east. The soldiers called it the Green Hell, the Death Factory, the Meat Grinder. They didn't call it necessary. If your family has a connection to the 28th, the 4th, the 9th, the 1st, or the Rangers, drop it in the comments. A lot of people watching carry these stories. We'd genuinely like to know who's listening. The Hürtgen is quiet now. Hiking trails run through the same ground where the 28th Division bled out. The towns have been rebuilt. Flower boxes, church bells, no visible sign of what happened there. You'd have to know what you were looking at to see it. But when autumn comes and the leaves fall, you can still see the foxholes, thousands of them. The trees grew back over them, roots threading through the edges, but the shapes remain. The same trails you'd walk on a Sunday afternoon without knowing what's underneath. German disposal teams still find ordnance when they clear fallen timber. Rusted helmets, dog tags corroded to illegibility, bone fragments caught in roots 20 feet from trails, about 6 meters, now marked for hikers. The rower dams are still standing, still functional. 33,000 men, for a forest the Army abandoned 6 weeks after the last division came out. And the river rose anyway,